All right, the last presentation in our muscular unit is on the naming of skeletal muscles and a general overview of the muscular groups that we have in the body. Since we have so many muscle groups in the body, we're not actually going to name all of them because you guys' little heads would actually pop off if I asked you to name all of them. So we're going to talk about some generic naming here in terms of how they come up with their names. All right, there are several features that we actually use to name them, and like I said, there's about 700. Now, different sources will have different numbers. A lot of it just depends on how you group them or divide them down. It's very hard actually to try to find 2 or 3 different books that will actually come to a consensus, so you may hear different numbers. So because we have so many is the idea, we need some unique features in order to name them. Because we need to be able to tell them apart. And the 3 main features that we use to tell skeletal muscles apart from one another, 2 of them you guys have heard of. The first one is the origin, which remember is the stationary end of a muscle. You then have the insertion, which is the end of the muscle where it attaches to the bone and it actually moves. And the third one actually kind of goes back to what we talked about with the joints in the skeletal system, and that is the action, the movement that is actually performed, like flexion or extension. So for example, we have the sternohyoid muscle, and you can if you look at that beginning part of that word, sterno, now in this case I looked it up and obviously it's the origin, but you should at least be able to tell that it's attached to the sternum. Now, it's also attached to another bone called the hyoid bone, which we really didn't talk about. It's a floating bone that actually is kind of in your neck. Another example is the extensor carpi radialis. Now, you can actually tell 3 things about this muscle: that it extends, it's attached to the carpal bones, and it's attached to the radius. So obviously, that movement is going to extend the wrist, but that's a muscle that you can actually tell 3 things about and find out some information on. And that's what I kind of expect you guys to be able to do. Now, in order to do this, you actually are going to have some practice with this, and I've sent home a muscle name for you. And what I want you to do is on the ticket out the door that you have gotten, I actually want you to write down your muscle name, and then tell me what information you can find out, or just based on the name, what information can you tell me? Where is it located? What kind of action does it perform? There are a couple of other things that we use, like for instance the word rectus, R-E-C-T-U-S, means that the muscle fibers are actually straight. Whereas if you have oblique or angularis, they're at an angle. So some of this is just logic, some logic here, but it's actually pretty easy to kind of determine a lot of the information about a muscle without actually knowing exactly where it's located. Now, muscles are also described based on their primary action. So in other words, the basic movement that they do. A prime mover is basically the main muscle that's responsible for a particular movement, and I'll show you what we mean by this in an example. But prime movers don't often work by themselves. They often have these little helper muscles called synergists that provide additional pull or help to stabilize the origin. In addition, for every action there's an opposite reaction, and we have antagonists which do the opposite of the muscle. Okay? It can also be a prime mover, but it does the opposite action. So for example, the movement that's actually being performed is really important. We can have flexion at the elbow, and when we flex our elbow, the biceps brachii is the prime mover, whereas the brachialis is the synergist, and the triceps brachii is the antagonist. Now obviously if I change this to extension at the elbow, the biceps would become the antagonist and the triceps would be the prime mover, and there would be a different synergist here. Now let's just talk briefly about the main muscle groups. We have 2 main divisions of our muscle groups, and it's just like the skeleton. We have the axial musculature, which arise on the axial skeleton, and they are responsible for moving the head, spinal column, and ribs. And we have the appendicular musculature, which stabilizes or moves the appendicular skeleton. Now we have subgroups of each, and that's what we're going to talk about, and that's as far into detail as we're going to go. We have the muscles of the head and neck on the axial musculature, and those are with facial expression, chewing, and swallowing. We have our spinal muscles, which flex and extend the head, neck, and spinal column. Trunk muscles, which form the walls that close in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. And then the muscles of the pelvic floor, which actually close the pelvic outlet, that opening at the bottom of the pelvis. Now the appendicular musculature, we have, again, two main groups, and those are the muscles of the shoulder and upper limbs, and then the muscles of the pelvic girdle and the lower limbs.